Welcome, everyone. Some of you know me, lots of you don't. My name is Rob McLeod, and there's a reason why I'm doing the introduction today. So I'm a dilettante in the brain world, make no claims of expertise at all, except that I have been funded by the NSF to do brain research. And that was one of the projects and many opportunities I've had to work with Sumientra over the years. And so I get to do the introduction. So we were just talking about how long it's been since Sumientra was first in Salt Lake, and she remembers about 10 years ago, and I think it was just before that I first met Sumientra in her hometown, which is Nijmegen in the Netherlands.
Good pronunciation.
See, I practiced a lot. So, and then her mentor was a guy named Dirk Steegman, who was a well-known neural engineering type person, and Tom Oostendorp, who's a longtime friend of mine, who got corrupted along the way and left, or partially left, the world of cardiology and moved over to the world of neurology. And he was the first example that showed me that there's a lot more similarities than there are differences in certain areas. When it's still a current, it's still a voltage, it's still conductive tissue, it's still a volume conductor problem, it's still Laplace's equation, at least in some of the contexts. And at the end of the day, there's even still action potentials. So, so that's sort of what tempted me to get involved in the field. But we're not here to talk about me. So Sumientra finished her thesis with Dirk. Dirk immediately retired, and I careful not to symbolism to that, whether he wanted to quit while he was ahead, or she burned him out. I don't know which, but he. But he retired shortly after that. Tom, my friend Tom Oostendorp, is still active and still very much both their lives, and so it's a real pleasure to have Sumientra come back to visit us. She was saying she knows a number of faces, even in this room, through our video conferences, which she participates in most weeks. And we have had this long-standing project that Chuck was especially involved in here. And so she's seen a lot of us virtually, but never actually met a number of you physically. And that was another reason to have the trip, so that she will be around actually for a couple more days. So please feel free to reach out to her and set up a time to talk with her. I think you'll find what she does really interesting, diverse. It's got lots of simulation, mathematics, but I think it's a really fantastic application of neuroscience, in a very translational setting, even though it starts with a lot of math and physics. And so with that, I'll pass the floor to Sumientra.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you for inviting me here. I've been enjoying your mountains a lot in the last 2 days. So I'm going to be talking about transcranial temporal interference stimulation, which is a new form of transcranial current stimulation that was recently developed. So I'll just start with an introduction to transcranial current stimulation for whoever does not know this, because I don't really know what's in this group. So basically, 20 years ago, Michael Nietzsche, who you see here, had the idea to slap 2 electrodes onto his head and send some current through. And so it's not that no one had ever done that before, but they were the first to try to actually measure the effects with TMS. So they used transcranial magnetic stimulation, gave pulses to motor cortex, and measured the effects with EMG electrodes on hand muscles. And by doing that, they saw that if you place the anode over the motor cortex and you stimulate for a certain period, then the excitability, as measured with TMS, goes up after stimulation. And depending on the amplitude and the duration of stimulation, which are the various traces here, that effect lasts for a certain time after stimulation, and then it goes back to baseline. And then if you reverse the current, also you reverse the effect. So since that study, TDCS kind of exploded. There have been hundreds of studies, people applying it to whatever area of the brain they could think of, basically. So people have tried this for migraine, depression, rehabilitation after stroke, and here you see basically the most used configurations of 2 electrodes, which was the standard for, I'd say, about 15 years. So currently, there is a lot of other options for TDCS. So there's MRI-compatible systems, multi-channel systems that you can actually program and give to a patient so that they can stimulate themselves at home. And there are these EEG-like caps where you can stimulate with multiple small electrodes. It goes up to 256, I think, electrodes if you have a lot of money. So these devices don't only supply TDCS, they also mostly supply alternating current. which is TACS. And here you see results of a study that is quite similar to the one I just showed for TDCS, where they measured TMS and EEG before and after stimulation, but now the stimulation is 140 hertz alternating current stimulation. And you see that again, the excitability goes up during stimulation and remains there after stimulation ends. So that's kind of the same as TDCS, so you would say, what's the point? But TACS actually, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with it. Here's an example of a study where they applied stimulation to motor cortex, and instead of just stimulating with a random frequency, they also measured the tremor of the patient and stimulated TACS with the frequency of the tremor. And then they saw that if you apply this matching of frequencies, that the reduction in tremor amplitude is much larger than when you just apply random frequency. There's also a lot of evidence of effects of TACS on intrinsic brain oscillations. So for example, on the left, you see a study where they measured EEG before and after stimulation. And the stimulation is with 10 hertz. And you see that in around 10 hertz in the alpha band, the power after stimulation increased. And on the right, you see a study where they measured local field potentials in ferrets. And as you can see, the spiking actually entrains to the stimulation frequency. So if you stay close enough with the frequency to kind of what's already going on in the brain, you can actually make the neurons follow the stimulation. So a little summary about transcranial current stimulation. It can change excitability of the brain, can entrain frequencies. There are many applications. It's very safe. Basically, the only common side effect is itching, so it's not too bad. It's super cheap compared to other stimulation methods, and people can use it at home. But also compared to other stimulation methods, the effects are fairly small and short-lived, and there's pretty high variability between subjects and even within subjects. Also, mechanisms are not fully known, which doesn't really help when we try to improve the effects. We try to improve the strength of effects or the duration of effects when we don't actually know how it works. Another issue is that TCS is very unfocal. There's a huge field kind of stimulating the whole brain, current goes everywhere, and that makes it pretty hard to reach a certain area if you want to. And also, even if you reach the area you want to, you're also stimulating in a lot of areas that you don't want to stimulate. And that specifically applies to deep stimulation, which has kind of been like the holy grail of TCS. People have always wanted to stimulate deep, but everyone thought, oh, you cannot reach it, because people kind of think that you only stimulate superficially for some reason. But with simulations, we see that the currents deep in the brain actually are high enough so that we should expect effects. But everything in between the electrodes and the target would receive field strengths that are even stronger than in your target area. So even if you reach it and you get an effect, you get a lot of effects that you don't want. So we have been, but we, I mean kind of the whole field, have been doing a lot of simulations of TCS to try to achieve several goals. So one, basically the first simulation studies were just replicating experiments. So what people did in the experiments, tried to simulate and try to understand how the effects came to be. Then there are a lot of studies where people are trying to design new stimulation protocols, and instead of getting a bunch of students and just testing all of them, it's nice to just simulate. And finally, there's these EEG-like caps with 256 electrodes, right? And you want to know where to put current to actually hit your target. So there's a lot of optimization algorithms out there right now to do that. So I'm going to give a little introduction into kind of the modeling. Again, if this is all known, just tell me to move on. So this starts, of course, with Maxwell's equations, which describe the interaction between electric fields and current and charge distributions. And then if you're in a static situation, which you are when we're talking about TDCS, but also for TACS, the frequencies are fairly low, so we can use a quasi-static approximation. Then in the end, we end up with Laplace equation, and we need to add some boundary conditions. So we're basically just saying where the electrodes are, we're applying a potential, and everywhere else, no current can go through the model. So this is what we need to solve. So for a head, which is a fairly complicated geometry, you cannot analytically solve that. So we use an approximation, and we use finite element method. To use finite element method, you need first to have a finite element mesh. And to make one, we use MRI measurements. We do T1 and T2 MRIs, use automatic segmentation software, then manual corrections in Sec3D, of course. Then we make triangular surface meshes to describe the boundaries between all the different tissue types. And then we fill those up with tetrahedrons to get one volume mesh in which each element has its own conductivity value. Then we do DTI measurements where we measure the anisotropy tensors and put those into the model. So now we have this model, which is a description of the geometry and the conductivity properties of a head. And we have our boundary conditions, which say where we put current in and out and where no current can flow. And then we put this into ski-run, and we solve it. So this nicely converges, and we're all happy. And so the output is the potential everywhere in the mesh. So on all nodes of the mesh, we get the potential value. And from there, we can calculate the electric field, the current density, whatever we want, really. So recently, there was this study, which was the first that ever measured intracranially during TACS, and then compared the results of these measurements to simulations. And as you can see here, the agreement between the recordings and the simulations were pretty good. So now we have those models. Let's put them to use. So on to the main event. So temporal interference basically is the application of two pairs of electrodes that both provide TACS at different frequencies. So when you do that, here you have an example. We have two pairs of electrodes, each stimulating with a different frequency, each producing their own field. And where those two fields interact, which is basically everywhere in the brain, you get this amplitude modulated field. And that has a carrier frequency that is the average of the two input frequencies and a beat frequency that is the difference. Now, if you choose those frequencies wisely and you pick them such that the two separate frequencies are so high that they are outside of the range that neurons respond to, but the difference is small and it's within the range that neurons can respond to, you should theoretically be able to have the neurons only respond to the beat field. And why would you want that, right? So that's basically here. So the field strength at the beat frequency is, you can calculate from this equation, which gives, at any point in the brain, the field strength in a certain direction. And if you work out that equation, you'll see that this means that the highest field occurs where the two fields are parallel, or at least where the angle between the two fields is small. And the field strength is determined by the weaker of the two fields in any location. And because of those properties, you could end up with a field that has its peak in the center of the brain instead of close to the electrodes, which conventional stimulation has. So this has been around actually for like 50 years. It's been applied in rehabilitation to arms and legs. But no one thought about putting it on the brain until these guys showed up. So Neer Grossman and friends decided to put this on the brain, which was a pretty good idea. And well, they first did it on mice, which is probably also a good idea. So I'm first just going to go over the results of their paper. So the first experiment they did in, I think about 10 mice, was an experiment where they tried to stimulate somatosensory cortex, and they did patch clamp recordings. And you see here that if you stimulate at 10 hertz TACS, so it's just conventional TACS, that the neurons actually respond at that frequency. Then they did the same thing, but now with 2 kilohertz TACS. So a very high frequency that we don't expect neurons to respond to, and hey, they don't. Then the interesting part is they applied TIS, so stimulation with 2000 hertz and 2010 hertz at the same time. And then you see that the neurons actually respond at about 10 hertz. So this suggests that neurons can respond to a different frequency of an amplitude modulated field. The second experiment they did was targeting hippocampus. And on this slice here, hippocampus is there, that's the target area. And these 3 areas are basically random locations in between the target and the electrodes. So these 2 gray areas are the electrodes. And so these are areas that we don't want to stimulate, and that's what we do. So then they took these brain slices and stained them for CFOS expression, which shows activation of neurons. So I marked a couple here to see what it looks like. So these bright green spots, those are actually neurons that were recently activated. And then after stimulation with 10 hertz TACS, you see that there's basically activation everywhere, all those 4 areas. So we're hitting the target, but we're also hitting everything else. Then again, 2 kilohertz TACS, there's basically no activation anywhere. And then they applied, again, TIS at 2 kilohertz and 10 hertz. And now you see that there is a lot of activation in the target area and almost no activation in the areas in between the target and the electrodes, which was our goal. So, yay. So this suggests that with TI, you can actually stimulate deep areas of the brain without stimulating overlying areas, which is something that wasn't possible with TACS. And then the last experiment, which was a recording of motor activity while stimulating primary motor cortex. So here is the setups, 2 electrodes on the skull of the mouse and 2 electrodes on the cheek. This is one current pair, this is the other current pair, and we're trying to stimulate left motor cortex, so we're hoping to activate the right forepaw. So again, we start with TACS, 10 hertz, and equal currents going in. Okay, so when the light goes on, actually that's when the stimulation starts. So you see the mouse is basically moving at 10 hertz, but the whole mouse is moving. It's not a happy mouse. Then again, we go to 2 kilohertz. Stimulation goes on. Not much going on, right? No effect. And then we go to TI. And now we see the right forepaw of the mouse moving at about 10 hertz. You also see some activity in the left forepaw, so it's not completely localized, but it is clearly better than the TACS example was. So I have one more just as an example. So this is 5 hertz, but it's just much clearer example of the stimulation. Okay, so this experiment suggests that you can activate muscles at the beat frequency, and what they also showed, but I'm not showing here, is that when you change the ratio of the 2 input currents, you can change what muscle actually gets activated. So you can go from right forepaw to left forepaw, whiskers, a lot of fun. So to summarize the study, we saw that neurons responded to the difference frequency, but not to the carrier. We saw that TIS modulated neural firing in deep areas without stimulating overlying areas. And we saw that you can stimulate different regions of the motor cortex selectively. So the conclusion of this paper, or at least the authors of this paper, was that TIS is a non-invasive form of DBS. So we were mildly skeptical and wanted to do some simulations. So we tried to replicate the motor cortex experiment in simulations. So the same setup as you saw before. First thing we do is build a head model, same as we saw for the human. Now do it for the mouse. So we have high resolution MRI. We segment the mouse, scan, and we have skull and all these different brain areas. And we are now particularly interested in the left primary motor cortex. Then we put the electrodes matching to the experiments, and we run the simulations for field 1 and field 2 separately. So we just calculate the fields like it's normal TDCS or TACS. And then we put the fields together. So I showed the equation before, how to calculate TI effect at any location for any direction. But now let's say we don't really care about direction. We just want to know what is the highest effect I can get at a location. So you can calculate that like this. And then we will also calculate the same thing for TACS to compare the results. So here are the results of field strength in a cut through the mouse, through the electrodes. And you can see for TACS, there's huge peaks, basically 3 peaks close to each of the electrodes. If you scale it, these are actually 2 separate ones, but they look kind of fused here. But there's a peak under each electrode. It's huge, definitely not focal. Then we look at TI, and we see that field is much more focal. It's actually a very small contained peak. It's fairly centered between the electrodes. It points a little bit to the side, but not as much as you would expect with the currents being so asymmetrical. But it does show that in the motor cortex here, the values are still around 75 to 100 volt per meters. So that still matches the experiments, showing that you could actually directly activate neurons at that, with that stimulation. Next thing we want to do is change the ratio of input currents to see if we can steer the field through the cortex. So as you see in both cases, fields move, but for the TACS case, it's just a really big field moving along. It's not very interesting. But for the TIS case, the field nicely sweeps across the cortex, which matches the experiments. So also one thing you see here is that when the current is higher on the right side, the peak is on the left side. And that makes sense because the peak of TI field is determined by the weaker of the 2 fields in any location. So if you have 2 fields with different input currents, the peak will always be on the side of the lower input current. So to summarize the simulations in mice, we saw that field strengths for both TIS and TACS are similar and are high enough to excite neurons. We saw that the peak field for TI is smaller than for TACS, and that it can be steered through the motor cortex. Oh, important point. So from the simulations also, we conclude that actually TIS can be a non-invasive form of DBS. Now we go to human experiments. Again, we make a head model. We select 3 targets in the brain, one superficial one, which is the FDI area of the left motor cortex, the right pallidum, and the left hippocampus as 2 deep areas. And we put electrodes on the model, 2 on the left and 2 on the right. So this configuration was, I would say, kind of, I don't want to say random, but it is loosely based on the mouse experiments, but made symmetrical because we're not really targeting any specific location. Then again, we calculate the maximum field at the beat frequency in any direction for TI, and also comparable field strength for AC. But now in the human, we also want to look at the direction of the field. So we prepare this vector field. So this is a little part of the cortex where you see each arrow represents the main direction of that one element. And in the gray matter, those are determined by basically being perpendicular to the gray and white matter surface. And in the white matter, they're determined by the principal component of the anisotropy tensor. And then if we put those preference vectors into that first equation, we get the field strength in that preferred direction. And for TACS, it's pretty easy. So we have these two fields. We've seen these before, right? So E1 and E2 separately. Then when we combine them, we get this. When we look at E1 and E2, we see that the further you get from the electrodes, the smaller the field gets, except for this little area in the middle, which is right above the ventricles. And if we look at TI, we see that that's exactly where the peak is. And that makes sense when we look here, because it's an area where it's right in the middle between two electrodes. And given that the strength is determined by the weaker of the field, that should happen where the fields are equal. And also in this area, fields are pretty much the same direction. So that's where we get the peak. And then in those areas in between the electrodes and the center, there is very low amount of stimulation. This is the same plot for TI, and then this is a similar plot for TACS. And here we see that for TACS, we're stimulating also that same center area above the ventricles, just because it's very conductive there. But we're also stimulating this whole patch of brain here. Everything kind of under the electrodes gets stimulated. Now, if we again if we change the ratio of input currents, we again can move the field through the brain. But we see now that it's not like the mouse, it's not that focal, it's not this nice little ball that you can move through the cortex or wherever you want it to go. It's actually this huge distributed field that is definitely steerable, but it's actually pretty big. So then we say, okay, let's see how much of the brain we're actually stimulating. And then we have to know how high the field should be to actually get an effect with TI or TACS, and we don't know. So that's one of the missing pieces of information I was mentioning before. So in this case, we're gonna put the threshold at 0.25 volt per meters, which is a value I took from previous simulation studies where we simulated basically the configurations of experiments that showed effects, and those field strengths that showed effect in an experiment were between 0.15 and 0.2. So to be conservative, we're setting the limit here at 0.25. So this is all the volume of brain tissue that gets stimulated with at least 0.25 volt per meters for these different ratios of input current. And yeah, that's still pretty big. It's not really what we were hoping for. So you might say, you know, you kind of put those electrodes there randomly. Maybe if you put them more to the front or to the back, things get better. No, they don't. So if we put them more to the front or to the back, things get much worse. And that's actually because more to the front or the back, the brain is narrower, so the electrodes get closer together, and the closer together they get, the stronger, the weaker of the field is. So we're stimulating a lot. And then if you consider that we have this threshold of 0.25, and I can also set it at 0.15, then you have just a whole blue brain. But we also had the preferred direction that I described before, and that's another of these pieces of missing information in the whole field of TCS and simulations of TCS, is that we don't really know what determines the effect. Is it the electric field strength? Is it electric field strength in a specific direction? Opinions differ. So let's look at the fields in the preferred direction, basically along the neurons. So we see that for TI, we're still kind of in the center, but it's definitely different, right? This area that was the highest for free direction is almost zero for the preferred direction, which makes a lot of sense if you realize that corpus callosum is there and the direction of the fibers there is perpendicular to the currents. Then for TACS, we see similar distribution, but still a larger part of the brain that gets activated. So here we kind of put it all together. This plot shows for TI and AC, for free and preferred, the maximum field we can find anywhere in the brain as a function of the current ratio. And then we see that always free is higher than preferred, which it should be, right? Because preferred basically is a subset of the free field. And we also see that the peak of TI almost hitting the AC line, which again it should be, because given that TI is determined by the weaker of the two fields, it can never be stronger than the sum of the two fields. And that exactly is the AC field. So the field strength of TI always has to be equal or lower than the field strength of AC. Yeah, I think, no, I wanted to say more about this. So we also see that the peak is actually when the current ratio is 1, so when the currents are equal on both sides, which, again, is because weaker rod fields. So one thing we see here is that the highest field we reach anywhere in the brain is 0.8 volt per meters. And now you can say, okay, you kind of randomly put those electrodes there, but it's pretty easy to see that with these kind of input currents, 2 milliamps, which are common safe standards for TCS, there's no possible way you're going to get field strengths high enough to compare to DBS, right? We're a factor 100 off. Unless you give people 200 milliamps of stimulation, you're never going to get there. And I'm not going to volunteer for 200 milliamps. So this is probably about as high as we can get. Then if we look at the different targets that we have an ROI in right pallidum, which is actually a small sphere, but I'm just showing the whole pallidum so it's more recognizable. And then we see this actually is very similar to just looking at the whole brain, only the peak is at about 0.1 volt per meters, which wouldn't even be high enough to get modulation effects. And then for the motor cortex, it actually looks very different. The peak of TI field occurs when the current on the right is about 4 times stronger than the current on the left, which again makes sense because in that way we get the peak on the left side of the brain. So to summarize all of this, we've seen that field strengths for TI and for AC are similar and are too low to excite neurons, basically whatever you do with it. We saw that the field strengths are high enough to modulate activity in superficial areas and in some deep brain areas. We also saw that the peak field for TIS is pretty distributed, but still a lot smaller than for TACS. And the peak field strength are always lower or equal for TI compared to TACS. We saw that TI can stimulate deep areas without stimulating overlying areas. And we saw that the peak of the field can be steered through the brain just by varying the current ratio. So all in all, we say that actually TI is not a non-invasive form of DBS. It's actually a more focal and steerable form of TACS, right? It has the same kind of field strengths, same kind of effects we expect as TACS. So in those deep areas that I showed, field strengths were even too low to modulate something. So we're going to try to optimize the electrode placement to see if we can get some current into the pallidum. Problem is, because we have this equation and the effect is determined by the weaker of the two fields, this is a non-convex problem. And any current optimization approaches that exist for TDCS do not apply here. So how do we solve this? Oh, and this is actually the objective function for this problem, which BL, which is a postdoc in our lab, made this nice picture. It does not look like a fun objective function. So we have two options. One is exhaustive search, and the other is to come up with some non-convex optimization. I'll first go into the exhaustive search. Then what we did was to put 88 electrodes on the head model which are based on this 10-10 system of electrode placement, which normally used for EEG, but also these days used for TDCS a lot for more high density stimulation. We cover the whole top of the head with that, and then we add electrodes to the neck and the cheeks because we're trying to hit more lower areas than are conventionally stimulated with TDCS, so we actually want to be able to hit that whole area. Then we construct the lead field matrix by simulating the field of each of these electrodes separately with a reference electrode. And then we construct all the configurations out of these 88 electrodes of 4 electrodes. So that's a lot. And then for each of these configurations, we simulate 21 different current ratios between 0.1 and 10. So in the end, we have 146 million different current patterns. And then we calculate for each of those current patterns the ROI field strength, the median value in the ROI, and we calculate the stimulated volume, as we saw before, which we define as the volume of brain tissue stimulated with more than 0.25 volt per meter. Then we group all these current patterns into bins of different EROI values, and for each bin, we select the pattern with the lowest stimulated volume. And then we get these Pareto lines that optimize focality and field strength in the ROI at the same time. Now, if we look at the free fields, we see that they go up pretty high. So we reach more than 0.35 volt per meters in the palatin, which is about 3.5 times more than we got with the random configuration we used before. So this seems to be doing pretty nicely and would definitely be enough to reach modulation type effects. However, if you do that, right, you are stimulating 30% of the brain, which could be fine, right? If you just want to get an activation in some area, you don't really care about everything else, you could do that. So it's an option. But if you also care about focality and you want to keep the stimulation outside of the ROI down, you could decide to use these configurations marked by these circles that are successful in the ROI, or at least potentially successful, because they have at least 0.25 volt per meters, which was our stimulation threshold, and they have the lowest amount of non-target stimulation for any current pattern that reaches that amount of field strength in the ROI. Okay. And we see that the preferred fields, of course, reach much lower field strengths than the free fields. Now we're going to look a little bit more at these current patterns here that are kind of optimal if you want to look at focality. So the optimal current pattern for TI field with free direction looks like this. This is basically an extension of the 10-10 system with these electrodes that we put on the neck and cheeks. And each line represents one current pair with a different frequency. And in this case, both of the currents are equal, which actually is something that out of almost all ROIs, you'll find currents to be coming out equal, because that is how you get the highest field again, because weaker of the two fields. When we look at the TI field in the ROI, we see that it's pretty high, but there's also high areas outside the ROI that actually are stimulated stronger than the ROI, which makes sense because we never controlled for that, right? We tried to find the highest stimulation in the ROI, and we never said that any other area could not be stimulated more. So this plot indicates the difference between the optimal AC and the optimal TI current pattern. Anything that's pink gets stimulated more strongly with TACS. We see that the ROI is nice and white because there's no difference there, because that's how we set it up. But there's a lot of pink there. There's a lot more stimulation with TACS, even when you optimized for TACS. And this is the preferred direction. So we get a different current pattern out of it, and also really different looking field. But we definitely do hit the target area and also some areas around. But there's much less stimulation for AC. So not less than TI, it's still more. It's just less bad as that one. So to summarize the results of the exhaustive search optimization, we found for 3 different RYs that the field strengths were about 3 to 5 times bigger after optimization than for a non-optimized current pattern. And we saw that field strengths for TI are likely to be high enough to modulate neural activity in most deep brain areas. Because if we can reach hippocampus and pallidum, we can kind of reach it all. Then we saw that optimized TIS is still more focal than optimized TACS. And also that what optimal pattern you actually want to use depends on what requirements you have in your experiment. And also, clearly we need to know a little more about how stimulation actually works to pick this in a wiser way. Second option is non-convex optimization. So this, again, was designed by B.L. Roch-Solvas, who is a brilliant math guy, does stuff that I do not understand. So we start with the same model, 88 electrodes, lead field. Now we pre-assign electrodes to either frequency 1 or 2, which is kind of a side effect of this method, because if we leave it free, each electrode could be assigned to 2 frequencies in this kind of optimization, and we don't want that. So we basically cut the head in half. We select half of the electrodes will go to frequency 1, and the other half will go to frequency 2. So then BL came up with this convex reformulation where we take advantage of the assumption that the RY basically is homogeneous or almost homogeneous in its behavior. Because if your RY is small, it's likely to firstly be one tissue type, either gray matter or white matter, right? So the conductivity is going to be the same. And if it's small, direction of currents, direction of preferred direction of neurons is going to be similar. And when that is the case, then the elements of the lead fields that represent the RY are going to be nearly collinear, and it's going to be a low-rank matrix. In this case, we can collapse the behavior of the RY to the principal component of the lead field. And that provides us with a candidate solution that is close to optimal. Then the next step is a series of convex relaxations that simplify the problem and give an upper bound to all remaining solutions, which allows us to compare the candidate solution to the best of the remaining solutions. And in this way, we can guarantee that our solution is actually optimal. And if it's not, we know how not optimal it is. Now here's a result of this optimization for, again, the same target area in the pallidum. And you see that we now are using a lot of electrodes, and currents are in total 8 milliamps. Before, we were using only 2 milliamps, 1 milliamp to each pair, or we were varying the ratio, but the sum was always 2. If in this case we were still giving 2, there would be no point, right? Because what you would get is just 4 electrons. Because you will always just send all the currents to the one configuration that gives you the best result. So the only way that this actually becomes useful is when your total amount of current that you have to give is higher than the amount of current you're allowing through each electrode. And in this case, again, we use a safety limit of 2 milliamp per electrode, but we have 8 milliamps in total to spread. And then you get this situation where you're using, let's say, 5 electrodes for field 1 and 6 electrodes for field 2. And we see this result. We're hitting, again, the RY, also still hitting other areas. That kind of remains. So one thing is, in this optimization, we're actually not including focality at all. I didn't talk about it in this part, where we're just trying to get the highest field strength in the RY. So that's one of the things we want to add to this optimization. But the nice thing is that you can get a higher field, because by distributing the current across all these electrodes, you can increase the field overall while still staying under safety limits. And in this case, we reached 0.35 volt per meters in the ROI, which was 1.5 times higher than what we got with the exhaustive surge in the preferred direction, I should add. So this is an overview of the two optimization methods. For the exhaustive surge, you only have 4 electrode solutions, and you pick the best solution from a discrete set of current patterns, while for the non-convex optimization, you can have any number of electrodes you want, and you can have continuous currents. Any value of current can go in there. So you have much more freedom, but you do need to pick which electrodes are going to be frequency 1 and which are going to be frequency 2. And as I said, currently we're only optimizing for the field strength in the ROI, and we're not including focality, which was included in the exhaustive surge. And also, we currently can only do this for the preferred direction, which actually is much easier than for a free direction. This is much faster, so it's about 2 minutes on a laptop. Exhaustive surge is about 10 hours on a cluster, so there's some difference there. And yeah, so this starts to make sense. You get a higher ROI field strength if you are okay with sending a total amount of current that is larger than 2 milliamps. Oh, one thing I should have added at some point ago, that once you go from 4 electrodes to more electrodes, you could technically still do exhaustive surge, right? But this explodes into something that would last till infinity. So conclusions of the whole spiel. We found that TIS, definitely not a non-invasive form of DBS, but it does have potential as a more focal form of TACS. Also, it can provide steerability with a single configuration. And you can say, what's the point of that? You can just move the electrodes, but you can be doing an experiment where you're not really sure exactly where your target is, and you want to move around a little bit to try to find the optimal location, or you could be in a situation where you have more locations you want to try than you actually have electrodes or current channels in your device in your lab. We also saw that the mouse is definitely not a good model for volume conduction in a human. And we also saw that intuition about TACS field distributions is pretty damn useless when it comes to TI. It basically, any simulation I did, it was like, oh, okay, did not see that coming. Also, we saw that existing TACS optimization algorithms also pretty useless for TIS. And we saw that we definitely need to know more about how this works in order to guide the optimization to a place that makes more sense. We need to know what we should be optimizing. Free direction, preferred direction. So we need to know more about how stimulation actually works. So there's a lot to be done, and we're doing also a lot. So something we're currently working on is neural models. So Chuck, who you all know and love, has been working on this for a long time, and he has some pretty cool results actually for neural models being activated by TI. And the next step is to combine Chuck's neuron models with my finite element models. Another thing we're working on is TI for ECOG and DBS, using electrode grids or deep brain electrodes to apply these 2 different frequencies and then use that to steer, for example, between 2 deep electrodes, steer the field between them. On the optimization front, we're repeating a lot of this with more head models, more ROIs, to try to find some general guidelines as to where to place the electrodes. For TACS, this is something that we can do. If you give me a target, I can tell you where to put them without optimizing. So it would be nice if we can do something like that for TI as well. To improve exhaustive surge, we are varying different constraints. For example, at this point, we're only looking at the stimulation outside of the ROI as either above or below a threshold, and that's it. But we can also look at the actual field strengths in the whole brain, and we can also include an anti-ROI, so basically one area that we do not want to stimulate no matter what. So that we currently actually have. Then we're also working on distributed ROIs. So for example, think about doing an fMRI study. You have this whole network that you want to stimulate at once, and you want to have electrodes everywhere to cover that. On the non-convex front, so including focality, and we're trying to get rid of this pre-assignment of electrodes to different frequencies. And then what this kind of should all lead to, right, is experiments in humans. And we know several labs that have been working on human experiments with TI for a while, but nothing has been published. So we were getting a little discouraged there, and we thought long and hard about what experiments we could do to show an effect that is dependent on difference frequency, without a doubt, but also can show focality. Focality as in we want to show differences between TI and AC, but also differences of non-optimized versus optimized results. We want to show that our optimization actually does something useful. So Matt Yarossi, who is a research scientist in our lab, came up with this cool idea of how we could use TMS to motor cortex to do this experiment. And so basically everyone is trying to use TI to stimulate deep, right? Because that's what we want to do with it. But if you stimulate deep, it's pretty hard to get objective results and accurate targeting. So we're going to stimulate motor cortex, hand versus foot area. We have clear readout with TMS, 2 distinct areas where you can see different amounts of effects. And we use optimization to stimulate, for example, either hand, not foot, or foot, not hand. And so we currently did this with 3 subjects, and we saw effects at the beat frequency. So we're cautiously optimistic. And we're also planning experiments similar with TMS to look at effects of carrier frequency. And then finally, I'm setting up an experiment with EEG, similar to one I showed in the beginning for TACS. So we measure the resting state EEG. We give TI stimulation. We measure resting state EEG again. We expect by giving stimulations with 2000 and 2010 hertz that actually the alpha band power will increase. Then the more, even more fun part there is that we can also look at what happens during stimulation. As anyone who's ever used TACS in combination with EEG knows, that's not fun, right? Because you're stimulating exactly at the frequency that you want to measure, which is basically impossible because the stimulation is 20 times stronger than EEG, and whatever you try to filter, you just cannot clean it. Now, if we apply TI, we don't actually have 10 hertz in our spectrum, right? But we still measure at 10 hertz, but we're not stimulating with it. So if that works, we could have a closed loop system for TCS that doesn't require any intricate cleaning methods, which would be nice. So yeah, I'm setting that up and hopefully starting once I get back to Boston next week to recruit subjects. That was it. Thank you for listening to me rambling for 45 minutes.